flight attendant humiliates a black teenager in first class until he makes one silent call that grounds the entire flight. He was only 15 years old, quiet, polite, ticket in hand. He stepped into the first-class cabin with steady steps, wearing a dark hoodie and clean white sneakers. No one paid attention until she did. The head flight attendant stopped, stared, and then demanded he move. She told him he didn't belong there. Then, right in front of everyone, she slapped his hand and ordered him to the back of the plane. No one spoke up, no one even whispered. But he didn't shout. He didn't shed a tear. He just sat quietly, took out his phone, and made one call. Minutes later, the flight was grounded. And what happened next changed everything. The first-class cabin of Flight 672 that morning was as quiet and orderly as a luxury waiting lounge, where everything was designed to make one feel like they belong. But not for everyone. Gray suits silently folded financial newspapers. Women in delicate silk dresses tapped their phones with meticulously manicured fingers. No one could have guessed that this calm would be broken not by an argument or a child crying, but by the appearance of a boy no one expected. Jordan Walker boarded the plane, carrying a small backpack on his shoulder and a book tightly gripped in his hand. He was only 15, but his walk was not clumsy like other teenagers. He stepped steadily, his gaze firm, his shoulders straight, as if he was accustomed to walking into places where others believed he didn't belong. A dark hoodie covered his head, his jeans fit perfectly, his white sneakers spotless. Every detail about him was clean and neat, but not showy. A pair of Black Beats headphones hung around his neck, modern yet subtle, just like him. In his hand was a first-class ticket. Not an upgraded ticket, not a gift ticket, but a valid one, purchased at full price. But it was precisely this, a black boy, dressed plainly, without an adult accompanying him, that made many eyes glance at him, then glance back. No one said anything, but the slight frown, the curious stares, and the involuntary scowl from the corner of some passengers' mouths said it all. A boy like him? Here? Jordan didn't care. Or rather, he pretended not to care. He had grown too used to looks like that, from teachers who never called on him, even when he raised his hand, to pedestrians who clutched their purses tighter as they passed by him. He had learned not to react. He knew that someone like him, a black, quiet, intelligent child, was easily seen as a threat just for existing in a space people assumed wasn't for him. He quietly made his way to seat 2A, the window seat, where he could see the sunlight reflecting on the runway before takeoff. That was his favorite spot. Not because of luxury, but because of the silence. Jordan opened the overhead compartment, stuffed his backpack inside, and sat down. He wasn't in a hurry to fasten his seatbelt, open his phone, or plug in his headphones. He just pulled out Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe and opened to the page he was reading. No need to act interested in the world around him, because he had long ago learned how to live in invisibility. At an age when many teenagers were still struggling with their voice and identity, Jordan had already understood one thing. His presence in any space was often considered wrong, even when he had every legal right to be there. The conversation in the cabin continued softly. A middle-aged man asked the flight attendant about the type of champagne being served. A young couple whispered about their vacation destination. No one paid attention to the boy who had just taken the seat by the window, or at least they pretended not to look anymore. But one person's gaze was different. At the end of the cabin, from the aisle connecting to the economy section, a woman stepped in, slender, her blonde hair neatly styled in the traditional flight attendant bun. The Navy uniform hugged her figure, her name tag gleaming, Sandra Mitchell, the head flight attendant of the flight. She moved quickly, her face free of any emotional wrinkles. She smiled at a man in a suit, nodded at an elderly woman, but when her eyes landed on Jordan, her expression changed noticeably. No smile, no nod. Just a stop, a glance from head to toe, a brief hesitation that made the air around Jordan chill a few degrees. Jordan looked up, his eyes meeting Sandra's only for a moment. Then he lowered his gaze to continue reading, acting as if he didn't care. But inside, he knew. Something was about to happen. He didn't know how far it would go. He didn't know who would speak up or who would ignore it. There was only one thing he knew for sure. This time, he would not stay silent forever. The atmosphere inside the first-class cabin maintained its usual elegance, but the steady footsteps of head flight attendant Sandra Mitchell carried with them an undercurrent of silent tension, spreading gently like a colorless smoke. The quick glance earlier wasn't mere curiosity, it was recognition. And for Sandra, that was enough to set in motion a series of actions she believed were in line with proper procedure. A procedure she had set for herself long ago. Sandra Mitchell, in her 40s, had more than 15 years of experience flying internationally. She was well known within the airline for her strict adherence to protocols, her thorough understanding of every procedure, and as a model trainer for new flight attendants. But accompanying those skills was something that never appeared on paper. Sandra believed she had the ability to sense who belonged where. A sixth sense, she called it, that allowed her to quickly assess who was deserving of a seat in this upscale space and who wasn't. What she didn't name, but always implicitly understood, was prejudice. When she stopped in front of Jordan Walker, nothing about his appearance fit the standard she had set for herself. A black boy, wearing a hoodie and white sneakers, sitting alone in the first-class cabin. To Sandra, that was abnormal, and abnormal things needed to be checked. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Her voice rang out, not loud, but enough for the nearby passengers to hear. The question didn't seek confirmation, but sounded more like a challenge, carefully disguised. Jordan looked up, a flash of surprise in his eyes, but he remained calm. He pulled the folded ticket from his hoodie pocket and handed it to her with both hands. Sandra didn't take it as though she were accepting something important. She snatched it away, as though he were hiding something that shouldn't be there. She scanned his face, then looked down at the ticket. Her cold blue eyes briefly narrowed. First class. She read it aloud, as if she didn't believe what was printed on the paper. "Yes, that's right," Jordan answered quietly. "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes, ma'am." The answer made her expression shift slightly, as if she had just confirmed something she had suspected. No one else was with him, no adult chaperone. No one to verify that this boy belonged here. Sandra tilted her head, her voice taking on a distinct icy tone. "I think there's been a mistake. This seat is for first-class passengers. Your ticket may have been mixed up, or perhaps someone transferred it. You need to return to the economy section while we verify this." Jordan remained seated, leaning forward slightly. "This is a real ticket with my name on it. Seat 2A. She frowned. "Listen, I don't know how you got that ticket, but you're causing a disruption to the seating arrangements. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to ask you to move, as per the rules." The word rules, coming from Sandra, no longer sounded like a neutral regulation. It became an invisible weapon, used by her to pressure those she did not recognize. The way she looked at Jordan was not the look of someone performing a check, but the look of someone who had already passed judgment. Jordan placed his book down, his hand lightly brushing the phone resting on the armrest. But before he could pick it up, Sandra suddenly reached out and slapped his hand away as she grabbed the phone. A sharp slap, echoed through the cabin. A few passengers looked up. A young woman covered her mouth. A middle-aged man awkwardly checked his watch as if he hadn't heard anything. No one said a word. Sandra exhaled as if she had just dealt with an inconvenience. "Now, please move to the back while we sort this out, quickly." Jordan didn't shout. He didn't resist. He just looked at her, longer than usual. In his eyes there was no fear, no overt frustration, only quiet disappointment. The kind of feeling only someone who had been looked down upon could understand. He picked up his backpack, pulled the hoodie down lower, and stood up. The first-class cabin remained silent. No one laughed, but no one stood up either. Not a word was spoken, even though everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard it. Jordan walked to the back, each step small but heavy, and began the unexpected journey from the front of the plane to the very rear, where the folding seats creaked and armrests were broken. He sat down, the phone resting on his lap, his hand still stinging from the slap. A message was quickly typed. "She slapped me and sent me to the back. I'm sitting in the last row." And as soon as the send button was pressed, Jordan looked out the window. He knew something was shifting, and it wasn't the airplane wheels. Jordan sat silently in the last window seat of the economy cabin, his gaze following the faint sunspots shining through the small window. The space here was completely different from the first-class cabin. Tighter seats, firmer backs, and everything seemed to shrink. Not just in size, but in courtesy. His hand still felt warm where it had been slapped. The message was sent, but the silence from the front cabin lingered in his mind, a silence more frightening than the slap itself. No one defended him, not a word of protest, not a word of opposition. The slap rang out clearly, like a declaration in the midst of a crowded room, but what made it more brutal was the response from the crowd. They chose silence. A man in a gray suit glanced at Jordan, then immediately looked away, his face returning to an indifferent expression as if he had never witnessed anything. A young woman exhaled softly, her confused gaze still not opening her mouth. A mother quieted her child by turning her back on seat 2A. Each glance, each unspoken action, all of them formed a collective refusal, as if they had agreed that silence was the peaceful way to endure the injustice that had just unfolded before them. Sandra Mitchell, now back in the galley behind the cabin to fetch a coffee, maintained her usual calm demeanor. She believed she had just done her job, maintaining order, upholding the standards of first class, eliminating any disruptive elements. To Sandra, anyone who made the space non-standard, even with a legitimate ticket, even acting politely, should not be there. She had done this before, though few dared to speak up. A passenger moved down due to a booking error. A man denied an upgrade for not following the dress code. An elderly woman sat in the wrong VIP row. All were dealt with by her firm hand, without needing thorough verification. And no one had ever come back to ask. No one had ever protested. But this time, she had made one mistake. Her target was not anonymous. Meanwhile, Jordan, sitting at the back row, remained still. He didn't cry. He didn't get angry. But his eyes, those quiet, sharp eyes, were watching everything. Each face looking down, each passenger pretending not to notice. Every tense heartbeat audible through shallow breaths. No one knew that the message he had sent minutes earlier was setting off a chain reaction beyond anyone's control. Hundreds of miles away, his father, Marcus Walker, had just placed his hand on the glass table in the top-floor office of Walker Tech headquarters, a company that owned over 60% of the airline's stock. Upon reading his son's message, he didn't get angry. He didn't bang the table or call a lawyer. He simply picked up the phone, dialed an internal number, a number that very few in the industry had the privilege to call directly. On the other end of the line, a woman's voice echoed immediately after the beep. "Hello, Chairman Walker." Marcus spoke briefly. "Flight 672. Check seat 2A. Something happened." "Yes, sir." The call lasted less than 15 seconds, but at an altitude of 10,000 meters it would slow down an entire plane full of people trying to pretend they hadn't just witnessed what happened. In the cabin, a few passengers started whispering. They didn't speak loudly, but their eyes were drawn to the vacant seat 2A. Meanwhile, some others glanced toward the back of the plane, where Jordan sat with his head down, phone placed face down on his lap, eyes still directed out the window. No one knew exactly who he was. No one knew that the silence they chose today would become a hot topic on social media platforms in just a few hours. And no one knew that the woman who had publicly humiliated a boy would soon find herself pushed out of the very system she thought she controlled, before the plane could even take off. When Jordan's message disappeared from the screen, the small signal he sent from the back row of the economy cabin began the quietest yet most decisive journey. No one aboard that Boeing 787 knew that this simple action, a message with just a few words, would lead to the entire flight being grounded, shake a multi-billion-dollar airline system, and push a woman who thought she was untouchable into the heart of responsibility. Far from the plane that was now preparing for takeoff, the highest floor of the Walker Tech building, a gleaming glass and steel structure in the heart of New York's financial district, remained in cold, eerie silence. The corner office, with a panoramic view of the horizon, was where Marcus Walker sat. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit. On his wrist was a black steel Audemars Piguet watch, but no one in that office paid attention to what he was wearing. They knew. This man didn't need material possessions to assert his power. Marcus was not the type of executive who governed with bursts of anger or loud statements. He ran his empire with terrifying calm. It was said that if Marcus Walker stayed silent during a meeting, brace yourself, because the entire system would change afterward. The phone vibrated lightly on the glass table. A message popped up. "She slapped my son and sent him to the back." Just that. No expression, no accompanying anger, just a dry, precise, cold statement. And enough for Marcus to understand that his system had just allowed something unacceptable to happen. He took a deep breath. He didn't look out the window. He didn't turn to his assistant. He didn't need to ask anyone else anything. Marcus pulled out his personal phone, unlocked it with his fingerprint. In his encrypted contacts, he selected a nameless entry, just the symbol of 3 red dots, and then dialed. The call was picked up almost immediately. A woman's voice, soft but professional. "Direct Operations Department. How may I help?" Marcus didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "Flight 672. Hold the plane. Seat 2A has an issue. I want an immediate report. No further actions until I call back." "Understood, Mr. Walker." Marcus hung up the phone. No shouting, no hand slamming on the table. Just an order, delivered with absolute composure. And from that moment the silent war had begun. On the plane, no one immediately noticed anything different. The engines hummed. The flight attendants were finishing up their final checks before the doors closed. In the galley, Sandra Mitchell was standing sipping her coffee. Unhurried, like the earlier incident had been just another part of the routine for someone who maintained standards. She felt right, reasonable, even satisfied. In Sandra's mind, she didn't see herself as wrong. She believed she was protecting the image of first class, a space she viewed as sacred, a place reserved only for those who understood how to behave, dress, and act like they belonged. A black boy in a hoodie, traveling alone with no clear explanation. To her, that was abnormal, and abnormal was something she was responsible for eliminating, even before the system had a chance to verify. Sandra had handled much more complex situations before. She had dealt with drunk passengers, kicked people shouting off the plane, and had even received awards for her quick thinking during an in-flight emergency. But it was these situations that had instilled in her the feeling of absolute power, that she could decide who belonged where and who didn't. And today, she applied that power to a boy. The problem was, she didn't know whose son she had just humiliated. Just minutes after Marcus Walker's call, the airline's operations center, located at the company's headquarters in Atlanta, received a priority signal from the board chairman's office. An emergency protocol was initiated. Hold Protocol, Class A. This was the highest priority level internally, designed to be used only when there was direct intervention from high-level shareholders or in the case of a special security incident. The simple order, but one with overwhelming weight. Flight 672, hold at the gate. Do not let it take off. Do not explain to the crew. Do not inform the passengers. Do not close the plane door. Within 3 minutes, the crew received instructions from the ground. Captain Richard Hammond, with over 30 years of experience, furrowed his brows when he received the order to halt the takeoff without a specific reason. He sighed, picked up the internal phone, and reported to the head flight attendant. Sandra Mitchell, who was now adjusting her lipstick in the galley mirror, heard the intercom. "Sandra, please report to the cockpit." A brief moment of unease passed over her face. But then she reassured herself it was probably just a routine check. She adjusted her uniform, smoothed out her sleeves, and quickly walked toward the front of the plane, where a confrontation awaited, unlike anything she had ever experienced in her 15 years of flying. In the cockpit, the small screen next to the communication system displayed a video call connecting from the high-level operations office. When Sandra entered, Captain Hammond stood upright, serious. He didn't say a word, just gestured, "Close the door." The door shut behind her, like the sound of the last control gate closing, something Sandra had always been confident she had a firm grip on. The screen lit up. The first face to appear was David Harper, the CEO of the entire airline operations system, a man who rarely appeared outside of high-level meetings. His face was cold, his eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. "Head flight attendant Sandra Mitchell?" he asked, without greeting, without preamble. "Yes, it's me." "We've just received direct instructions from the chairman of the board, Mr. Marcus Walker, regarding a serious incident involving the passenger in seat 2A. Do you know who that passenger is?" "It's just a boy. I thought he was in the wrong seat." "No," Harper interrupted. "That boy is Jordan Walker, the son of Marcus Walker, and you just humiliated him in front of all the passengers, because you assumed a black boy couldn't sit in first class." Sandra's throat went dry. Her tie tightened around her neck. The atmosphere in the cockpit became suffocating. I didn't know." Her voice trailed off. "Exactly, and that's the problem," Harper said coldly. "You didn't know, but still acted like you knew. And because of that, this flight will not take off until you apologize to the boy, in front of all the passengers, and return him to his proper seat." Sandra stood frozen. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Captain Hammond added, his voice as hard as steel, "If you don't, you'll never fly again. Not just on this flight, but forever." The silence stretched on for a few more seconds. Then Sandra turned. Every step she took out of the cockpit felt like a layer of pride falling away. The cockpit door opened, and for the first time in her career, Sandra Mitchell understood. She was no longer the one in charge of this flight. Sandra Mitchell closed the cockpit door behind her mechanically, but inside, something began to crack. Although her exterior remained calm, each step she took toward the narrow space of the control cabin felt like she was walking directly into the eye of a storm, though she couldn't see where it was coming from. David Harper, the CEO of the airline, didn't say another word. He stared directly at the camera, his gaze piercing through the screen, as though interrogating Sandra's increasingly confused eyes. "The boy you sent to the back, the one sitting in seat 2A, is Jordan Walker," he said slowly, each word marking a boundary. "The son of Chairman Marcus Walker." A cold wave ran down Sandra's spine, not because of the man's reputation, but because of his silence. A powerful man like Marcus Walker choosing to respond with a simple call, with no threats, no harsh words. This meant that the storm rising behind that silence was far larger than she could have imagined. Sandra swallowed. I didn't know, Number. You didn't know. But you acted as if you knew exactly who that boy was, and that he didn't deserve to be in that seat," Harper interrupted. "You didn't verify, you didn't report. You handled it unilaterally based on your personal judgment. And that judgment, this time, will make you pay." Captain Richard Hammond, still standing silently beside her, finally spoke, his tone even but cold. "Miss Mitchell, this flight will not take off until you follow the direct instructions from the operations office. Apologize to passenger Jordan Walker in front of all passengers and return him to seat 2A in front of everyone?" Sandra almost whispered, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "In front of everyone," Harper emphasized. "You humiliated him publicly, so you'll have to correct it publicly." Sandra turned away, leaving the cockpit without a word. Her heart raced beneath her stiff white shirt. She walked through the first-class cabin, past the vacant 2A, the seat she had once deemed not belonging to a boy in a hoodie, and now it stood waiting for its rightful owner to return, like a silent testament to her misjudgment. Avery Brooks was waiting in the galley. When she saw Sandra walking past, the young woman's eyes were filled with concern. "What's going on?" Avery asked softly, almost instinctively. Sandra didn't answer, but the smirk that had always lingered on her face had completely vanished. As she passed the curtain dividing the cabins, Sandra could feel the eyes of the passengers in the economy section on her. Some looked up from their books. Some quietly pulled their headphones off. And then, her gaze met the one that was fixed directly on her from the back row, Jordan Walker. He didn't move. His headphones still hung around his neck. His phone lay on his lap, the screen facing down. His eyes weren't hostile. They weren't disdainful. They weren't accusatory. But it was the calmness in those eyes that made Sandra feel as though she was being scrutinized by a presence too great to escape. She stopped in front of Jordan. "Jordan!" she called, her voice no longer certain. He didn't respond. A few nearby passengers turned their heads completely. A middle-aged man had his phone ready to film. A young woman pulled down her mask, her eyes unblinking. Sandra took a breath. "I want to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. I may have judged incorrectly." Jordan slowly turned to look at her. His eyes were deep and bright, as if waiting to see whether her next words would truly be sincere, or just another part of a performance directed from above. "Judged incorrectly?" His voice was soft, steady, but carried clearly, as if the entire cabin could hear. Sandra's lips trembled. "I didn't check the ticket properly. I thought there was a mix-up." "It wasn't the ticket, was it?" Jordan interrupted, his eyes never leaving her face. "You looked at me, and you thought I didn't belong in that seat." No one moved, not a whisper in the cabin. The whole plane seemed to hold its breath. Sandra opened her mouth, but no words came out. The truth Jordan had just spoken exposed what she had never dared to name. He stood up, tall, calm. "I'll return to my seat," he said. "Not because you invited me, but because that's the seat I paid for legally." As they walked back down the aisle, every eye followed them. This time, not with curiosity or judgment, but with awareness. They were witnessing a shift in power. The one who had been deemed unfit was now walking back with silent pride, while the one who had once held authority in the cabin became the quiet escort. Jordan sat back in seat 2A. He placed his phone on the armrest, opened his book. He didn't glance at Sandra again. Sandra stood there for a moment, not knowing what to do next. She turned around and walked to the back of the plane, and with each heavy step, the trap she had set to exclude others was slowly closing in on her. Sandra Mitchell returned to the galley behind the cabin like a shadow, her usual straight posture now seeming to shrink under the weight of something that had never happened in her 15 years of flying. Each step through the first-class cabin, once her domain, controlled with a cold glance and a firm voice, was now a path filled with eyes. The faces she once brushed past without a second thought now looked up at her, no longer avoiding her gaze. But what unsettled Sandra the most was not the gazes, it was the silence. A new silence. Not the complicit silence of when she slapped Jordan, nor the familiar silence of obedience in commercial flights. This was the silence of those witnessing someone in power being unseated from their rightful place. Each step echoed softly on the carpet. Each footfall felt like a bell tolling in her mind. Your career is turning a page, and not in the way you wanted. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Hammond had not yet left his position. On the screen connected to the central communication system, David Harper's face still gleamed in the cold light from the LED bulbs. He hadn't hung up after issuing the order. He was waiting. Because he knew only when Sandra had carried out the order, not just through action, but through her submission to authority, would he hang up. At David Harper's level, he represented not only the internal power of the airline, but also a shift in the culture of the aviation industry, where discriminatory behavior, whether subconscious or openly displayed, could no longer be accepted or overlooked. "Report back to me when she has apologized and the boy is back in his seat," Harper said, his gaze not leaving the screen. Hammond nodded. "I'll report directly." Harper remained silent for 2 seconds before ending the call with a light tap, yet the sound was as final as closing a heavy door. In the galley, Avery Brooks stood still, as though waiting for an earthquake after the first tremors. She had witnessed everything, not through actions, but through her eyes. And she remembered. When Sandra returned, the two of them met in the narrow space. Avery didn't speak. She just looked straight ahead. For the first time since she entered the profession, Avery saw a head flight attendant she had once admired step back. Sandra adjusted her tie. Her hands trembled. In just a few minutes, everything she believed was control had slipped through her fingers like sand. "I've apologized," Sandra whispered as if talking to herself. Avery didn't respond. She understood. The apology wasn't for Jordan. It wasn't to make amends. It was to protect the remainder of the career that had just cracked. In the first-class cabin, Jordan Walker still sat quietly in seat 2A. He had returned to his seat, but it was no longer the same as when he first entered. This time, everyone had seen him. An older woman gave him a slight nod as he sat down. A gray-haired businessman across from him set his phone down, his gaze complicated, part regret, part admiration, part avoidance. Jordan didn't look at them. He placed the book on his lap, opened it to the previous page, and rested his hand on the spine of the book, ready to read. But his eyes weren't looking at the text. He wasn't reading, he was listening. Listening to the whispers spreading from behind through the cabins, through passengers who had filmed and were now whispering, "Who is that boy?" Why did everything stop just because of him? In Jordan's mind, the sounds didn't make him angry. They made him awake. Because this was no longer just about him. He was no longer a child who was sent to the back for not fitting in. He was now a mirror reflecting the system that the adults had ignored for too long. On the ground, an internal email was sent to all senior management of the airline. Flight 672, delayed at the request of the chairman of the board. A discrimination incident is under urgent investigation. On social media, a video from a passenger in the economy section had begun to circulate. The clip clearly captured the slap, Sandra's cold reaction, and Jordan's head-down walk as he headed to the back. Within 10 minutes, it had over 10,000 views. Comments began flooding in. That slap hurt more because of the silence in the entire cabin. Do they really think a black kid in a hoodie can't be a first-class passenger? He didn't say a word, but made the entire flight stop. That's power. Sandra was still standing in the galley, her hand gripping the edge of the counter as if clinging to the last solid thing left. But she knew. The wheels had begun to turn, and this time, they weren't turning toward her. In the cockpit, Captain Hammond received a second call from the center. "We've received confirmation. Passenger 2A is back in their seat. Apology has been made publicly. You're cleared to close the door." He turned to the head flight attendant through the internal communication system, his voice no longer serious, but colder than professional. "Ms. Mitchell, prepare to land when we arrive. Someone is waiting for you at the gate." The order from above had been issued, and this time there was no turning back. Jordan's words cut through the smooth surface of Sandra Mitchell's assumptions, spoken clearly, calmly, without anger, but sharp as a knife. And that simple brief statement reversed the entire power dynamic on Flight 672. Sandra Mitchell stood there, in the narrow aisle of the economy cabin, where she never thought she would have to step unless it was for service duties. She had grown accustomed to walking with her head held high between the first-class seats, where each question, "Would you like wine or champagne?" served as an unspoken confirmation of the quiet power she wielded. But now, the eyes of a 15-year-old boy had left her unable to find any ground for her pride. Jordan didn't shout. He didn't cry. He didn't condemn. But his gaze, that gaze wasn't just an accusation. It was a declaration. "I know, and I will no longer accept it." Sandra opened her mouth to respond, but her throat was as dry as a desert. All the reasons, all the excuses she had ready, about safety procedures, about unintentional misunderstandings, about ticket verification processes, suddenly became meaningless in front of the teenager staring at her without flinching. The air around them seemed to freeze. A passenger from a nearby row slightly adjusted the angle of their phone. A young woman in a business suit stopped tapping on her phone and just silently watched. The usual sounds of the plane, the clicking of seatbelts, the turning of pages, seemed to hold their breath. Sandra nodded. The nod wasn't strong, but it carried all the weight of a person just thrust into reality. She turned, her hand still resting lightly on the back of the seat in front of her, and softly said, "Please return to your seat." Jordan stood up, not in a hurry. He neatly placed his book into his backpack, then calmly slung it over his shoulder in a way that was almost unbelievable for a student who had just been humiliated only minutes before. He didn't look around. He didn't need to, because his silence was the loudest sound in the room. The aisle between the cabins, already narrow, now felt like an endless path, where Jordan walked step by step, and Sandra followed behind, uneasy, like a shadow no longer viewed with trust. Avery Brooks stood at the front of the first-class cabin, watching Jordan from a distance. Her gaze met his, then moved to Sandra, who was walking behind, slow and stiff, as though her shoes had been filled with lead. When Jordan returned to seat 2A, no one said anything. But something had broken, not with sound, but with the movement inside each person. He sat down, adjusted his seatbelt, pulled out his book, opened to the previous page. He didn't look back at Sandra again. That gesture, so calm it was almost extraordinary, shattered any remaining hope she had of covering up her mistake with a simple apology. Sandra stood there for a few seconds longer. No one asked her to do anything more, but her presence at that moment had become redundant. Avery Brooks didn't say a word, but in her eyes there was something very clear. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Sandra turned and walked to the back. She heard a few whispers, a soft chuckle, the sound of a phone being pressed, but she didn't dare look back. In the cockpit, Captain Hammond received a second message from the operations department. Passenger 2A has returned to their seat. Apology has been made publicly. You are cleared to close the door. He didn't say anything more. He just nodded and adjusted the watch on his wrist. But inside, a strange feeling crept in, a silent admiration for a boy who had stood up without needing to raise his voice. Jordan sat still. His eyes were no longer on the words. His thoughts were racing, not about what had happened, but about what it had just uncovered. He didn't know that the first video had already begun circulating on social media. He didn't know that his father, Marcus Walker, was contacting the airline's PR team, requesting an internal investigation into the systemic discrimination. He only knew that when he walked back through the economy cabin to his seat, the only thing that made him hold his head high wasn't his father's power. It was the truth he hadn't avoided. At the back of the plane, Sandra Mitchell sat against the galley wall. Her hands gripped tightly, not out of anger, but because for the first time in her career, she no longer knew who would stand up for her. No one was on her side. And for the first time, she understood what it felt like to be pushed behind, without reason, without judgment, just because others thought she didn't belong. When Jordan settled back into seat 2A, a space that once felt familiar now carried a different weight. The ivory leather seat, the polished drink holder, the small oval window letting in the soft light from the runway outside, everything was the same as before. But the silence now was no longer the indifferent quiet it had been. It had transformed into a form of silent reverence, like a young king stepping into his coronation, not with a crown, but with dignity. Jordan didn't rush to read. He opened the book, placed it on his lap, and lightly ran his hand along the spine as a habit. But his eyes weren't on the page. Instead, they silently swept through the first-class cabin, where the looks had changed color. Some looked at him with curiosity. Others deliberately avoided looking, as if afraid to face the fresh bloom of shame. A man, seated at an angle from 2D, wearing a blue suit with a brown tie, took a small sip of water and set the glass down with a hurried swallow, as though trying to hide the sound. He didn't speak, but his gaze lingered on Jordan, as if he wanted to say something that couldn't quite form into words. And that was what kept Jordan from feeling angry. He didn't need an apology from everyone. He needed them to see what had been ignored for too long. In the row behind, a young passenger, a white woman in her mid-20s wearing an NYU hoodie, was quietly adjusting the frame on her phone. She was the first to film the moment Sandra slapped Jordan's hand, and the first to upload the 21-second clip to Twitter with the caption, "Black boy slapped and kicked out of first class for not fitting. Now, guess who got called to the cockpit?" Less than 30 minutes later, the clip had over 25,000 views. The next 10 minutes, it was shared by a human rights journalist. 10 minutes after that, the name Jordan Walker appeared in Twitter's top search trends. And then, the social media storm began. Meanwhile, in the airline's PR office, the phone kept ringing incessantly. The PR staff hadn't even had time for their afternoon coffee before they were called into an emergency meeting. The CEO, who had just received a second contact from Marcus Walker, was forced to activate the crisis management protocol, something typically used only in the event of a plane crash, a high-level personnel scandal, or a racial discrimination incident that caused an uproar, and ironically this time, it all started with a slap. On the plane, Jordan remained silent. He didn't check his phone. He didn't look for news. But he knew, just as those who have grown up in prejudice and silence know, that something bigger than himself was happening. And it started with the very silence he had just kept. Up front, a flight attendant gently approached. "Would you like anything, sir?" Jordan shook his head. "Just water, please." She handed him a glass. Her hand didn't shake. Her eyes didn't avoid his. In those eyes there was recognition. Not because he was Marcus Walker's son, not because the media was in an uproar, but because now everyone had seen the difference between power and true authority. At the back, Sandra Mitchell still hadn't left the galley. She stood motionless, clutching a service tray, her eyes vacant as she stared at some vague point on the wall. Her mind spun, not from exhaustion, but from the invisible collapse that was breaking apart, piece by piece, in the system she had trusted completely. That if she was right in her feelings, her actions would always be forgiven. For the first time in her flying career, she knew what it felt like to be isolated in the very place that had once been her domain. No one said anything to her. No supportive gaze, no words of inquiry. Only the quiet whispers from the passengers. A man in first class, a silver-haired, light gray suit, after a moment of hesitation, leaned slightly toward Jordan. "I saw what happened earlier. I don't know what to say." Jordan turned to look at him. Quiet, not angry, not blaming. "I should have said something when she slapped you," he continued, his voice shaking slightly. "I saw it, but I stayed silent." Jordan nodded slowly. "I understand." Then he turned back to his book. But the man's gaze still lingered, filled with confusion, and a small cut of conscience beginning to bleed. Not far away, a group of passengers was whispering, "Who is he?" "He's the son of the airline's CEO." The way he walked back, like he'd never been knocked down. It's not like he really wasn't. Jordan sat quietly, in the silence, but everyone could see he had returned, not as a victim, but as a leader, silently, steadily. The plane had yet to leave the runway, but outside, a storm had truly taken off, not from the jet engines but from the power of truth being recorded and spread. The phone screens of millions across the United States suddenly displayed the same headline, the same short video just over 20 seconds long. "Black boy kicked out of first class. Turns out he's the son of the airline owner." Blurry footage shot by passengers in the economy section. In the narrow frame, Jordan Walker stands up after being slapped on the hand, then silently lowers his head and walks to the back of the plane. while a woman in uniform, Sandra Mitchell, stands rigid, cold, as if she had done the right thing. It wasn't the slap that made the video go viral. It was the silence of everyone in the cabin, the way Jordan said nothing, and the way the flight attendant behaved as if it was perfectly normal. That was the real spark. Less than an hour after the first video was posted from the NYU student's Twitter account, the hashtag #Seat2A made it into the top 10 national trends. 10 minutes later, it climbed to second place, just behind a major sports event, and then surpassed that event when a prominent human rights journalist shared the video with the caption, "Silence is not neutral. It is complicity." The boy in the video didn't need anyone to defend him. He stood up for himself. But we need to ask, why didn't anyone else stand with him? On Reddit, both our Public Freakout and our Black Excellence reshared the story. Thousands of comments flooded in, with increasingly intense headlines. One slap that struck the entire airline industry. No one stood up, but he didn't need anyone. He has the truth. When power doesn't scream, it only needs a single message. On TikTok, young female voices began to analyze the moment Jordan stared directly at Sandra and asked, "You looked at me and assumed I didn't belong there. You didn't check anyone else's ticket, just mine." That quote was pulled, turned into captions, set to somber background music, and became a viral quote, striking directly at prejudice. At the airline's main office, an emergency meeting was called at 9 p.m. New York time. The conference room, with its white lights and black leather swivel chairs, all eyes were fixed on the LED screen displaying media metrics. Brand mentions up 750%. Negative sentiment in comments, 83%. Most asked question, what will they do to hold themselves accountable? The communications director pointed at the graph. We are facing a symbolic crisis, not because he's Marcus Walker's son, but because people see themselves in the moment of being pushed aside. Meanwhile, in the sky, as Flight 672 finally began to take off, Jordan remained seated, eyes focused out the window as the sunset light broke into soft yellow patches through the glass. He didn't know he was going viral. He didn't know what was happening on the ground, but he could feel the movement, not of the plane, but of the world slowly shifting toward him. At the back, Sandra Mitchell received her first message on her work phone. "You'll need to stop at the gate. HR and media are waiting." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her fingers, once accustomed to arranging seats, giving safety instructions, handling situations, now fumbled, unable to find any words to reply. And the most painful thing was, no one came to protect her. No colleagues, no passengers who had once been favored by her, no system still stood by her. Only the truth and the video spoke for everything. On Instagram, popular accounts shared images of Jordan reading his book, accompanied by the caption, "They tried to move him to the back. He walked back to the front. Without a single word, he changed the whole flight." In first class, a woman in business attire leaned toward Jordan. "You really made me rethink. About myself. About the times I turned away." Jordan looked at her, his gaze calm. "No one needs to shout, ma'am. Just don't remain silent." And from seat 2A, Jordan not only reclaimed his position, he reignited what society had long tried to extinguish, the ability to stand up, not through power, but through the dignity of being human. "I saw everything," the middle-aged man in the gray blazer said quietly, his voice trembling as though he had been holding it in throughout the flight. "I saw it, but I didn't do anything. I'm sorry." Jordan looked up, his eyes neither cold nor angry, just like a mirror reflecting the truth. "It didn't start with violence," he replied slowly, his voice soft as a breath, but clear in the silent cabin. "It started with silence." The response left the man speechless. And not just him. 2 rows behind, an older woman placed her hand gently over her chest. The young woman seated across from her removed her headphones, her gaze hesitant as if she had just realized something deeper than what she had witnessed. No one was being accused, but that silence, the silence that had once forced Jordan to leave seat 2A in shame, was now looking back at each of them with the conscience of their own actions. At the back of the plane, Sandra Mitchell still stood by the cabin door, leaning against the wall, her gaze unfocused. In her hand was a small piece of paper, a copy of the suspension order pending investigation, sent up to her via internal communication. In the last line of the document there was a sentence she read over and over again, no less than 5 times. The incident involves behavior suggestive of racial discrimination, improper handling of procedures, and serious media consequences. Just 1 line, but it felt like a silent indictment without a courtroom. Sandra remembered the first moment she saw Jordan walk into the first-class cabin. Her probing gaze, the silent skepticism revealed through her stiffened posture and quick glance. She hadn't asked to verify. She asked to confirm her assumptions, and when Jordan didn't react as she expected, didn't flinch, didn't back down, she acted like someone in power, not like someone in service. But now all she had left was the truth, and her image was spreading on social media like a living testament to what thousands of others had experienced but couldn't record. Meanwhile, at Marcus Walker's office, the media situation was being updated minute by minute. The headlines from national news channels kept coming in. CNN: "The slap in the air shakes the airline industry." The New York Times: "From silence to a wave of resistance. Jordan Walker and number seat 2A." The Guardian: "A quiet rejection turns into an undeniable truth." Marcus was not pleased. He knew, with his power and his name, he could sway public opinion, issue statements, and force the airline to apologize. But he didn't want to stop there. He called the legal team, not to sue, but to demand a comprehensive internal audit of the company culture. "This is no longer about me or my son," Marcus said. "This is about every child who's been treated as if they don't belong, just because they don't look like the people sitting next to them." On the plane, a young female passenger with a camera gently pressed the shutter. She didn't turn to film Jordan, but the small electronic sign above his seat, 2A. No need to add any words, she knew. Just that seat number was enough to start a whole social dialogue. An older flight attendant, someone who had worked with Sandra for many years, approached her at the back of the plane, hesitating. "Are you all right?" he asked, but the question felt more like a polite formality than genuine concern. Sandra looked up, her gaze exhausted. "I think I've just lost what I believed was the most solid thing in my life, the rightness of personal intuition." The flight attendant didn't know how to respond. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, then quickly withdrew it. Some things couldn't be soothed by a gesture. A few seats behind Jordan, a young girl around 10 years old, sitting beside her mother, gently tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, why didn't anyone stand up to help that boy?" The mother fell silent. Then she leaned down and whispered, "Because they thought someone else would." But no one did. The girl looked at Jordan, her gaze innocent yet surprisingly profound. Jordan caught her eye and gave a slight nod, just a small one. But that nod was like a bridge between 2 generations, one that had endured, and one that was learning not to let history repeat itself. As the plane gradually reached cruising altitude, the flight attendant announced that meals would be served, and the cabin began to return to its usual peaceful routine. But this silence was no longer the same. It was no longer the quiet of indifference, but the silence of awareness. Jordan closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest. He knew that when the plane landed, a lot would be waiting for him. Reporters, camera lights, a late apology, interview requests, exploitation, perhaps even turning him into a symbol for a movement. But he didn't need to be a symbol. He just wanted no one else to be slapped, by hands or by looks, just because they didn't fit the invisible garment called standard. At the back of the plane, Sandra Mitchell stood against the galley wall. Her hands were clenched, but not out of anger, because for the first time in her career she didn't know who would speak up for her. No one stood by her, and for the first time she understood what it felt like to be pushed back, without reason, without judgment, just because others thought she didn't belong. The cabin door beeped softly. A security officer in dark uniform stepped in, accompanied by a woman in a blue blazer holding a clipboard. They said nothing, only nodded lightly at Captain Hammond, then turned towards the galley, where Sandra Mitchell stood, as if she had known this moment would come, but still wasn't prepared to face it. In the woman's hand was a thin file, but to Sandra it felt as heavy as a stone on her chest. The cover read, "Employee Removal Protocol, Immediate Effect." Inside, everything was printed clearly, with bolded terms: procedural violations, mishandling of passengers, actions leading to a severe media backlash, and finally, indefinite suspension pending internal investigation. Sandra looked at the words. Employee name: Sandra Elaine Mitchell. Her hand trembled as she held the pen. Her fingertips were cold, sweat forming on her brow, despite the stable air conditioning on the plane. Her signature, once a symbol of authority on internal reports, thank you letters to passengers, new staff training forms, now rested at the bottom of the document like the final period of a long chapter in her life. After signing, Sandra was instructed to gather her personal belongings and prepare to disembark the plane as soon as it returned to the gate. A rare event when the journey hadn't even been completed. This was not just a dismissal. It was a clear statement from the system. The person who once decided who belonged where was no longer allowed to belong here. As she walked towards the front, her eyes passed over the first-class seats. Jordan was still sitting there, quiet, not looking at her, not needing to. She passed him like walking past a mirror, where she could no longer see who she was, no longer the head flight attendant, no longer the one who maintained standards, just a woman who had realized she had lived too long in a bias she called experience. As Sandra neared the cockpit, Captain Hammond opened the door, making way for her. She said nothing, but his gaze was enough to understand. He knew. He had seen. And now he was just following the procedure, just like she used to. Sandra walked past him. But in her heart, where the cockpit once symbolized safety, something she believed would never betray her, it was now the place witnessing her being stripped of her power. The cabin door opened. The hallway connected to the bright white jet bridge. She stepped down. No one escorted her. No one looked back, not even a whisper. Only the sound of her footsteps, silent like the shadow of biases once hidden beneath a perfect uniform. On the plane, an unspoken change was felt in the air. A middle-aged passenger pulled his blanket tighter, as if realizing he too had stayed silent for too long. A young woman took out her phone, deleted the half-written tweet, and started again. Not with anger, but with acknowledgement. I saw. I said nothing. I was wrong. In the economy cabin, a young flight attendant stepped up to replace Sandra's position. She took a deep breath before pulling the curtain. No one had taught her how to replace someone who had been dismissed mid-flight, but she knew better than anyone. Today's mission wasn't to serve passengers, but to restore trust. In the cockpit, as the plane turned back to the gate and Sandra was escorted off, Captain Hammond glanced at the radar screen, then turned to his co-pilot, his voice steady. "It's been a long time since I've seen a flight where no one spoke, but everyone's listening." The young pilot nodded, his gaze landing on the screen. 2A, the seat still lit. And there, Jordan Walker slowly closed his book. Not because he was tired, not because it was over, just because he had read enough for today. He tilted his head toward the window where the sunlight flickered on the wing, as though the world was waiting for a landing point, not just in coordinates but in justice. No one in the cabin was reading anymore. The entertainment screen on the back of the seat remained on. The list of films kept scrolling, but nearly no one pressed play. Headphones still hung around necks, but the music had stopped. The forgotten water glass sat empty on the tray. The food packages remained unopened, and every movement, everything, slowed down as if the entire cabin was holding its breath to a single thought. I saw, and I did nothing. It was a thick silence, not the quiet of sleep, but the quiet of self-reflection. The sky outside was calm. The plane had regained stable altitude after returning to the gate and taking off again, but Flight 672 was no longer the same. The story was no longer in the control of those who thought silence was safe. A white businessman in seat 3A opened his phone, not to check emails but to type into the Notes app. "I used to pride myself on being neutral. Now I realize I've allowed my own comfort to overshadow the responsibility of being a human being." He glanced at Jordan, the boy still sitting quietly in 2A, like a living monument built from the brokenness of indifference. No medals, no statements needed. Yet, he made the entire cabin unable to return to how it had been. An Asian woman in the economy cabin, the one who had instinctively lowered her head when Sandra first yelled at Jordan, now quietly typed a post. "It's not just black people who get pushed to the back. We've all stayed silent when it happened to someone else, and that silence is what's nurturing these slaps." She looked at her young daughter sitting next to her, her gaze hesitant as though trying to understand something too complex to articulate, but too clear to ignore. In first class, Jordan didn't change his posture. He still sat straight, both hands resting on the open book. But he wasn't reading anymore. His eyes looked out the window, where the sunlight fractured into patches on the clouds like a broken mirror, reflecting not only the external world, but what was happening inside every passenger, a slow but deep awakening. Avery Brooks walked lightly down the aisle. She held a tray of water, but her movements were slow, not because of laziness, but because she was aware that every gesture was now being observed through eyes no longer indifferent, like at the start of the flight. She stopped in front of Jordan, gently tilting her head to ask, "Would you like anything else?" Jordan looked at her, shook his head lightly. Then he spoke, softly, but clearly enough for her to hear. "Thank you for seeing me." Avery hesitated for a moment. Not because of surprise, but because rarely do people thank you just for being seen. But for Jordan, being seen had been a victory in itself. In the cockpit, Captain Hammond sat upright, no longer in his usual relaxed posture with autopilot engaged. He wasn't looking at the flight map, but at the crew list, where the name Sandra Mitchell had just been crossed out in digital red ink. He sighed. A sigh not from fatigue, but from the moral burden he had once thought didn't concern him. On social media, the waves were still rising. The news outlets started digging deeper, from the incident to the history of discrimination in the airline industry, from the slap to how many similar cases had never been recorded. And amidst the waves of anger, messages began to appear. I used to be Sandra, not hitting, not yelling, but I once looked at a lost child and thought, you don't belong. I want to apologize, not just to Jordan, but to the me of that day. Sandra Mitchell, now sitting alone in the isolation area after leaving the plane, didn't turn on her phone. She knew. She didn't need to check the news, didn't need to check social media. She could feel it. Not the pressure of the media, but the weight of the awakening spilling out from 2A. On the seat, she took out her employee ID card, the one that, each time she wore it, made her feel she had the authority to define the space in the sky. She turned it in her hand, then put it back in her pocket. For the first time in years, she thought, maybe I should start over, with new eyes. And so, even though the plane hadn't landed yet, Flight 672 had changed direction forever. Not on the map, but in the minds of every passenger, those who had stayed silent, turned their heads, kept quiet, and now learning how not to do so again. The plane touched down and slowly glided down the runway like a smear of ink stretching across the gray canvas of the late afternoon. The passengers hadn't yet returned to their usual rush to stand up. No one grabbed for luggage, no one jostled to get out the door first. They sat still, silently, as if waiting for something more sacred than a destination, an inner landing. The familiar ding sounded, signaling that seatbelts could be unfastened. But this time, no one moved. Jordan Walker remained seated in 2A, the very seat he had been stripped of initially, and the same seat he had reclaimed through unyielding silence. The airplane door opened. It wasn't the passengers who got off first, as usual, but a group of 3 people in the airline's dark gray uniforms who stepped in. Leading them was a tall man with a tense expression, carrying a black briefcase. He was accompanied by a woman from Human Resources and a communications advisor. They stopped in front of 2A. "Jordan Walker?" the man asked, his voice deep and soft, but not insincere. Jordan nodded slightly, not standing up. He didn't need to stand to make people listen. "We're here on behalf of the airline's executive board. We apologize," he continued, his tone earnest, his gaze steady. "We will conduct an independent investigation, review the procedures, and retrain the entire crew. This is not something we condone or tolerate. It will not happen again." Jordan looked directly at him, his gaze now not filled with anger, but demanding a deeper truth than any apology. Understanding. "I don't need an apology," he said. "I need people to understand what happens when a child is deemed unworthy just because of how they look. I need people to stop waiting until there's a camera, or until they know who my father is before they start caring." His words were spoken softly, like the wind sweeping past the body of the plane, but they made the man in front of him subtly flinch, as if he had been touched at his most vulnerable point, his conscience. This scene was not only witnessed by the airline representatives. A few passengers remained behind, not necessarily because they wanted to observe, but because they felt they needed to witness something that had started long before the plane had even left the ground. The young woman in the business suit, the one who had sat silently when Jordan was scolded, now spoke up. Not loudly, but enough for everyone to hear. "I won't stay silent anymore. I've seen it." Another man, the one who had bowed his head earlier and said, "I'm sorry," nodded. "Me too." The airline representative stood still for a moment. Then the woman from Human Resources spoke. "Jordan, would you like to share anything else? Anything at all?" Jordan responded slowly. I want you to understand that if I weren't Marcus Walker's son, I'd probably just be a boy kicked off a plane, and no one would ever know, and Sandra Mitchell would still be flying." He paused, then continued, his voice calm as usual, but carrying a weight that no words could lighten. "And this has happened to so many people. But there were no cameras, no one shared it, no apologies." The communications advisor, after a few seconds of silence, spoke the first words since they had entered the plane. "We understand, and we will make the entire revised procedure public. No hiding." Jordan nodded. Not an acceptance, but as a mark. He had heard, and he would remember. He stood up. Slowly, not in a rush, not looking for victory. Just one step forward toward the airplane door, opening not just for him, but for a series of changes behind him. The other passengers began to leave the plane. A few people slightly lowered their heads as they passed by Jordan. One whispered, "Thank you." Another, younger, gently placed their hand on his shoulder before silently walking away. As Jordan stepped out the door, the waiting cameras were there. But he didn't look into the lenses. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just walked on, like a child who had just redrawn the moral map for an entire system. And behind him, the airline representatives stood silently watching him, each carrying a question that wasn't easy to answer. How many storms will it take to shatter the fogged glass that covers this system? A few minutes after stepping off the plane, Jordan's phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen displayed a message from his father, Marcus Walker, one of the most influential figures in the tech and aviation industries in the United States. But at that moment, he was simply a father waiting for a decision from his son, someone he had once taught that there are things you don't need to shout for people to hear, but if you speak, make them remember. "Son, the media is calling. Major networks are reaching out. CNN, NBC, even BBC just emailed. Do you want to speak out?" Jordan read the message in silence. His hand hovered over the screen, then he typed back, "I will speak, but not for myself. I want to speak for those who were pushed to the back without anyone asking for their ticket." He didn't write anything more. No explanations. His words, at this point, were no longer to tell a personal story, but to open a door for voices that had been silenced. In a separate corner of the airport, a group of journalists were ready. They didn't have much time, but they came with dozens of questions, all centered around one boy, 15 years old, who had just brought the entire system to a halt with nothing more than an unwavering gaze and a silence that refused to yield. In the distance, the passengers who had shared the flight with Jordan were slowly leaving the gate. No one spoke loudly, no one rushed, but everyone knew they had just experienced something bigger than the trip itself. The young woman who had been sitting in seat 4B lingered near the interview area, not to speak, but to watch from afar. She clutched her purse tightly, but her gaze never left Jordan, the same person she had turned away from when he was humiliated. But now, she couldn't turn away. In the airport's control room, the airline's media team was watching live through the internal cameras. On the screen, they saw Jordan standing still against a simple backdrop. No stage, no podium, just a wooden chair, a bottle of water, and a boy who didn't need anyone to help him stand tall. A reporter spoke first, his tone formal. "Jordan, if there's one thing you want the entire nation to hear, right now, what would you say?" He looked straight into the camera. No hesitation, no doubt. Don't wait until someone has a father who owns the airline to believe they deserve a seat. His voice wasn't loud, but the room fell silent. Every day, there are thousands of passengers. Each person has a story, but no one asks, No one looks closely. They just see the color of your skin, your clothes, your accent, and decide where you belong. Another reporter chimed in, speaking more softly. So, what do you want to change? Jordan nodded slightly. I want no one to be sent to the back of the plane just because they don't look like a first-class passenger. I want flight attendants to learn to ask before they assume. And I want the passengers, don't stay silent, because silence is not innocent. It's complicit. That statement was shared across every social media platform within 20 minutes. The hashtags number Jordan Walker and number Seat2A became symbols not only for the incident, but for a new wave of dialogue about prejudice, invisibility, and the true value of people. Meanwhile, at Marcus Walker's office, he received an update from his assistant. His speech is being broadcast live, over 5 million views already. Marcus didn't smile. He simply nodded, a nod that carried the weight of the years he had lived through. The years when he too had been asked for his ticket, not to verify, but to deny. Now, his son had spoken the words he once wished he could have said when he was that same boy. And in the airport's hallway, Sandra Mitchell, who had once controlled the sky like an invisible gatekeeper, sat quietly in the waiting area. On the TV screen in front of her, a clip of Jordan's words played again. I don't need an apology. I need people to understand what happens when a child is deemed unworthy just because of how they look. She didn't look away. She didn't cover her ears. She let those words pierce through her like an unavoidable truth. And so, before the plane landed, Flight 672 left an indelible mark. Not in aviation history, but in the consciousness of everyone who witnessed it. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, the tires screeching against the runway, creating the familiar dry, screeching sound. But this time, that sound didn't just mark a physical destination. It marked the opening of a spiritual journey. The cabin filled with the familiar ding. A flight attendant's gentle voice announced, "You may unfasten your seatbelts. Thank you for flying with us." But no one hurried to stand up. No one scrambled for luggage. No one rushed to be the first to get out. They all sat quietly, as if waiting for something more important than their carry-ons, something they needed to take with them, not from the overhead bin, but from their hearts. Jordan Walker, 15 years old, remained seated in 2A, his head slightly tilted toward the window. He wasn't looking at the people starting to move behind him. He was listening, not to the footsteps, but to the quiet rhythm of a moment that had forever changed them all. The first passenger to walk past Jordan was a middle-aged man, his jacket still misbuttoned from rushing onto the plane. As he passed Jordan, he paused for a moment, turned, and said, "You've reminded me of something I'd forgotten a long time ago. Silence also has a cost." Jordan nodded lightly, saying nothing. Next was an elderly Asian woman, small in stature but with eyes that gleamed brightly. She looked at him, pulled a peppermint from her pocket, and gently placed it in his hand. "When I was your age, I didn't dare sit in the front. Today, you sit there on behalf of those who could never sit." Jordan gently squeezed the candy in his hand. Not because of the candy, but because of the memory the woman had gifted him with a small but weighty symbol of history. The line of people continued to move past. A young woman in a white blouse, who had avoided Jordan's gaze throughout the flight, stopped longer this time. She said nothing. But when Jordan looked up, she gave a subtle nod, a sincere, acknowledging, and awakening nod. A young boy, about 10 years old, walked by with his father, looking at Jordan as if he were a superhero. As he was pulled along, he turned and whispered, "You're really cool." Jordan smiled, his first smile since boarding the plane. The last passenger was Avery Brooks, the flight attendant who had stood for truth, even if only with her eyes and chosen silence. She stopped, no longer in uniform, but in civilian clothes like any other passenger. She held a small handbag, but in her eyes was an unhidden pride. "Would you like me to wait with you?" she asked gently. Jordan shook his head, still holding a faint smile. "No need, you've seen, and you didn't turn away. That's enough." When the entire cabin had emptied, Jordan stood up, slowly, not in a hurry. He turned and looked at the plane cabin, not as a passenger but as a witness. Every row of seats was now empty. But for Jordan, each seat was a question that had been asked, and would not easily be forgotten. Outside, the airport had prepared a separate area to greet him. There was no media frenzy. That had been Jordan's request. Don't make this a spectacle, just make people think. Marcus Walker, his father, stood waiting in a dark suit, his eyes following every step his son took. He didn't open his arms, he didn't run to him. He just smiled, like a man who knew that some moments as a father are best experienced by stepping back and witnessing. Jordan walked up and placed his hand on his father's shoulder. "I've spoken." Marcus gently squeezed his son's hand. "And the world is listening." That day, Jordan's brief speech was shared millions of times online. But what moved people the most was the final image. Jordan, sitting still in seat 2A, holding his open book but not reading, his eyes gazing out at the sky. The caption beneath the photo was simple. The boy didn't need to shout, but he made the whole world go quiet to listen. And so, Flight 672, seemingly just a few hours long, became a journey that transcended prejudice, entered the hearts of individuals, and forced an entire system to stop and reflect. A flight that lasted longer than the distance and deeper than the altitude. There are stories that don't need shouting to stir hearts. There are characters who don't need to stand on podiums to teach anyone. They just need to sit in the place they deserve and let the world see the truth. Jordan Walker did that. At 15, he didn't demand justice through anger. He demanded it through dignity, and the silence that forced an entire system to question itself. The passengers on Flight 672 didn't just travel from one city to another. They flew from indifference to awareness, from silence to awakening. And perhaps they would never forget the boy in the black hoodie sitting in seat 2A, the one who made them look at themselves. What about you? Have you ever witnessed an injustice and chosen to remain silent? Or have you ever wished you had the courage to speak out? Share your story in the comments below, because every change starts with a conversation. If this story made you reflect and you feel the need to see the world through fairer eyes, like, share, and subscribe to Spread the Message, and to not miss stories with such power. We can't change the past, but we can rewrite how we respond to injustice, starting today.